Welcome to Science Frontiers, a space for discussions in the frontier areas of science, technology, and society. I'm your host, Binay Panda. In the part two of our interaction with Michael Eisen, who is a Howard Hughes Medical Institute investigator and a professor of genetics, genomics, and development at University of California at Berkeley, we shall continue our discussion on scholarly publishing. What is wrong with the current system and how to make it right? Mike, welcome back, and thank you very much for your time amid your very busy schedule.
No, my pleasure.
I really appreciate your willingness to do this due to the technical glitch that we had last time. I couldn't save the second part of our conversation, so I really appreciate that. And just to recap, in our first episode, we spoke about the history of scholarly publishing, what went wrong, and some of the initiative like eBiomed that tried to make it right. Now, in today's discussion, let's broaden the topic. I want to start our discussion today by asking you on something that looms large in every scientist's life, and we are talking about the 900-pound gorilla in the room, the journal impact factor. Now, you and I may not care about the journal impact factor, but a majority of scientists do want to publish their research papers in journals with very high impact factors. This is because our system rewards those who do that. I can tell you that in India, despite having the guideline to the contrary, we still always often ask to put the journal impact factor in all our grant applications and fellowship applications, promotions, and etc. Now, can you tell our audience what is actually wrong with journal impact factor?
Right. So there's two things. So first of all, it's worth just describing what it is so the audience understands. Its journal impact factor is a bibliometric measure that was developed 50 plus years ago. It's about as old as I am. It was developed to originally to help librarians allocate their resources and subscriptions to journals that kind of mattered, whatever that means. And obviously that's a hard thing to quantify. So what was done back in the day and continues to this day was to develop a statistic that essentially counts how often the articles in a journal get cited in other papers. And so, modulo some definition of what counts as a journal and therefore what counts as a citation, the idea is extremely simple. It is that a journal, and it's important that this is a measure of a journal, not of a paper. A journal gets an impact factor by calculating the number of times, its papers from year I-2 and I-1 are cited in year I. So, the impact factor for 2022 for a journal is basically the number of times papers in that papers from 2021 and 2020 for that journal were cited in 2022. And by journals, by papers published in some large collection of journals. So it's a measure of the, essentially the mean number of times papers in a journal are cited. Is that a measure of the impact of a journal? Maybe, right? Like if you think about, what does it mean to have a journal? You want the papers to be read, you want them to be used, and to some extent, the more frequently that they're cited, the more frequently they're being read and used. So it is a measure of something. The problems, however, are manifold. First of all, and they all basically boil down to the question not of is it a valid way to analyze a journal, which is probably, but to analyze a paper published in a journal, right? So the problem we have now is that we're judging individual works of science more or less exclusively by what journal they're able to convince the editors to publish them in, and then assigning a prospective value, right? Well, the only reason you'd ever do that, assign that value to a paper, is on the assumption that if it occurs in a journal that has an impact factor of 30, that you will expect that paper to be cited 30 times basically in the in the 2 years after it's published, which we know is just completely false, right? It's a mean, first of all, just as a rough statistic, forget about the question of whether we can do this well or accurately. The impact factor is a average across the journal, but it's heavily influenced by a very small number of highly cited papers in most cases. So the fact that you appear in a journal with an impact factor, a high impact factor, does not mean your paper will be highly cited. It just means that you're being published alongside of, or at least in the same year as, some other papers that are going to be highly cited, right? And the idea that this tells us something meaningful in a prognostic way about a paper's value is just rudimentarily and superficially dismissible. It does not predict the number of times a paper will be cited with any degree of accuracy. If you were using that as the basis for betting, you were wagering on the number of times a paper was going to be cited based on its impact factor, you would lose all your money immediately, because it has very poor predictive value. So why do we use it, right? So and I think this is a little subtle as to why people put value. And I think that the reason people put value on it is not because you're predicting the number of times papers get cited, but because by and large, journals with high impact factors are harder to get into, right? It's a kind of self-defining system. You have a high impact factor that makes people want to publish there, so more papers are submitted there. So the journal can be more selective in which papers it chooses. Journals try to let's be real, they try to optimize their impact factor because they're judged on the impact factor. So they select papers that they think are going to propagate their impact factor. And so you create a system, even if journal impact factors have been assigned randomly at the beginning of time, the fact that higher impact factor journals are more attractive means more people submit to them, and therefore they have a better choice of papers to choose the ones that they think will be highly cited and propagate their impact factor, and so on. And so what it really is a measure of selectivity. We use it because it's true that it's harder to get your papers into high impact factor journals than it is to get them into low impact factor journals. And, there's a lot of complexity there. Some fields, highly cited fields, their journals have higher impact factors, not because of higher selectivity, but just because of the structure of the field. But putting that aside for a second, we basically use it because we have decided that we value in science competition amongst scientists for getting their papers into particular journals. And we have a basic hypothesis that forcing scientists to compete for space in selective journals will both identify the best science and bring out the best in scientists themselves, right? The idea being that the journals know what they're doing somehow and are able to predict, they're able to predict which papers are going to matter, which papers are going to be useful and impactful, and however you want to define that, by pre-publication peer review, something we know that they don't actually do particularly well. And that second, that the process itself is good for science, that somehow forcing scientists to compete for limiting resource of publishing in high impact journals and forcing them to respond to criticism and whatever demands the journal makes to get published will elevate their science in a way that's beneficial to all of us. I think both of those hypotheses are dubious. I think that I think there is a long track record. Ask any scientist, does the best work get published in the high impact journals? Well, maybe slightly more likely to find really impactful work in high impact journals, but it's by no means a definitive designation, right? Lots of papers published in the highest impact, most prestigious journals turn out to be wrong or irrelevant, not through any fault of the authors, but just because science is a imperfect art and figuring out what's going to matter is imperfect. So it's already a flawed concept that just getting published in a high impact journal means you've done high impact work, right? You're asking the journal to judge the impact of a paper in a predictive way, not in a post facto way. You come back and look 10 years later, it's much easier to decide what papers had an impact, but people don't get hired based on an analysis done of their work 10 years in the future. They get hired and funded based on an analysis now. And it's not necessarily a bad part of science that you would try to predict how impactful a paper is, or try to just judge how impactful a work is. But it's certainly not something we do particularly well. And second, we also know that a lot of really high work that is in retrospect had a huge impact on the field is not published in high impact journals. So I think nobody would argue that if you are sitting in 2020 and you want to know what was the most impactful work published in, produced in 2010, you should look exclusively at high impact journals, right? Many of the most impactful papers from that time were not published in high impact journals. So we know it to be a fundamentally false premise. But I think even more important is that the idea that this process is good for the practice of science because it forces people to elevate their work to the standards that journals have. I think that is probably the bigger flaw in this system, that it has become so important in so many places. And while, we're not asked in the US to write the impact factor of of journals on our CVs, it's not like we don't use that implicitly, right? People know what journals carry the highest impact factor. So it's almost an unnecessary. It's a measure of how unnecessary it is to write it down that we don't use it. We certainly use it in how people are judged, although, people are trying to change that, but I think by and large, it's still an incredibly important factor. And I think this idea that it brings out the best in scientists is belied by the personal experience of most scientists who find the process of publishing papers, whether it's in high impact journals or somewhere else, because much of the process is propagated throughout the whole system, where it's so important to get published in those journals that you're basically handing over to the editors and reviewers of the journal the authority to tell you what you have to do and how you should do your own science. Absolutely. And so it's so important that people are willing to do it. It distorts science more than it improves it, in my mind.
Absolutely. And I can't agree with you more. In fact, I give an analogy of impact factor being used as a surrogate of quality is like scientists outsourcing their work of judging quality. It's like, we don't want to do a job of a reviewer. So all I need to do is to look at the journal impact factor and say, right, the high impact factor must be high quality work. But let me play the devil's advocate for our audience. Now, folks will say that here is Mike Eisen, he's talking about journal impact factor not being important, but look at him. He has a PhD from Harvard. He is a postdoc from Stanford, a Nobel laureate as a mentor. It's easy for Mike to talk big and talk about not having importance of journal impact factor. But is it really possible for folks today of getting a job, getting tenure, getting grants without publishing in those journals with so-called high impact factor?
Right. So I'll say, I'm not saying it isn't important for people in the current system. I'm saying it shouldn't be. And I think there's an important distinction, right? I think it is obviously used at many different levels in many different ways, whether explicitly, like it's used in some countries where there's a formula for, your value as a scientist is reduced to a sort of, applying a function to the impact factor of the journals you publish in, or implicitly, like it's done here and in many other countries where, while there's no formula, if you were to offer up two scientists to somebody to evaluate, and one has all their papers in Nature and the other has all their papers in PLOS One, the system will reward the people who get their papers into Nature. It's definitely the case. I think it is overstated. The impact it has on people's careers is overstated to some extent, because nobody really tries to do the control, right? Nobody has 5 papers that they could get into Nature and chooses to publish them in PLOS One, right? I think we don't really know what the world would look like if scientists just said, I'm not playing this game at all. I systematically refuse to participate in a system that is corrupt. If they just said, look, here are my papers, I'm posting them all in bioRxiv, you can read them. If you like them, hire me. If you don't like them, don't hire me. Essentially, nobody does that. And to the extent that people have, it's because they come from a position of strength already. I mean, I've done a little bit of that. I've not, since my lab started, I haven't published in high impact factor journals. But as you point out, I started from a position of strength. People knew me, they knew my work. I had, prominent mentors. I trained at the right institutions. Like I was not an unknown trying to make my way in the world. I was starting from a place where I was already successful. So, I lost you there for a second.
Yeah.
So I think, could we have a world where this isn't, this isn't used? Sure. I think, I think that, you're absolutely right that a lot of this is driven by kind of a laziness, intellectual laziness and practical laziness in the field, where we're just going to say, well, the authors had to fight and claw and convince somebody to get their paper into Nature. And even though that person isn't me, the reviewers and editors weren't colleagues at my institution, we're comfortable granting by proxy to them the power to decide who's done good science. And, it is only partially true that it's both necessary and sufficient to get your papers into Nature. A lot of the people we hire at Berkeley in faculty positions don't have papers in high impact journals, although many, indeed most, do. And, I think it is possible to succeed in science just by doing really good work, even if it isn't published in those journals. But, because everybody plays this game, it also is sort of true. Nature does have their pick of, by and large, their pick of the best science that's done worldwide. Nature Science Cell, I mean, it's not just Nature, but those journals do have their pick of the best science. Very few scientists choose to eschew the system. And to the extent that the best work isn't published in those journals, it's because we're fundamentally unable to predict what science is impactful. It's not so much because the system isn't trying to identify them, it's just failing to do so. So we do kind of have to recognize that global science has just decided that this is the game we're going to play, right? That the game we're going to play is you're going to do work, and then you're going to try to get your work into journals, and you're going to do what the editors and reviewers of those journals say because it's so important and valuable. And we all accept the idea that this is both necessary and good somehow for science. And I think that there's a lot of reasons to question that assumption, that, it's neither. I think the two biggest things to me that are problematic about it are that, we know that we aren't good at identifying the best science this way. It's not true that the system works to identify impactful work.
Absolutely.
So we know it doesn't work well. And second, but because we put so much emphasis on this one system, it's become basically impossible for anything else to matter. Like if you do, outside of those, rare examples of someone who published an obscure paper and it won a Nobel Prize, right? Your work remains judged based on where it was published for a remarkably long time. even after a Nature paper has been shown to be irrelevant or wrong, it's still a Nature paper. And even after a PLOS One paper has shown to be incredibly important, it's still a PLOS One paper. The system suppresses a more robust and accurate and honest assessment of value. So it really isn't good. And we really, it's also just old.
Yeah.
It's like, it's not the way the world works. It's, the modern world, for all of its flaws on the internet and everything, like, it does allow us a much more robust and nuanced way of assessing work that isn't just saying, all right, I'm going to pick 3 people at the moment this paper is initially born. I'm going to pick 3 people and let them decide how important this work is, and ignore everybody else who reads it, both now and in the future, ignore other views of the paper. That's the real problem. Is the internet should allow us to have a much more robust and nuanced way of assessing science. And this system suppresses that. It doesn't just do a bad job. It prevents other things from happening.
And as you said, we do not know unless we have an alternate system to try it out, so that people can say, hey, you know what, here is an alternate system. It has worked as good or even better than the old system. So we are not even giving ourselves a chance to try out an alternate system in the age of the internet.
Yeah, I mean, it's shocking to me
It
that,
is.
the internet, basically half of history since the invention of the impact factor is the age of the internet, more or less, right?
Yes.
So in that time, we've done, if anything, we've strengthened a system whose rationale was to assess journals, right? Journals existed only because of technology of the time, right? I think we talked about this in the first part of this, right?
Yes.
Journals existed because it made sense in an era of printing and postal service to bundle papers together based on interest and audience. Once the internet came along, it makes no sense to have journals. They're a complete anachronism, and yet this system persists, not because people think journals make any sense in the age of the internet. We don't have, like, it just doesn't. It's an irrational system for the current technology. Nobody would reinvent this if the system disappeared. And yet we continue to use this antiquated system almost entirely because we continue to use the impact factor to judge papers. So this thing goes hand in hand, right? We maintain a system that is flawed in so many ways. It's economic. It's technologically irrational. It's economically insane how much money we spend on it, and it's grossly inefficient. And yet we keep it more or less entirely because it's the only way we've invented, or accepted, I should say, to evaluate scientists. So it really, if you think about it, it's this combined existence of journals and the value we place on them that is holding back our innovation. I mean, I don't think, if you're outside of science, I don't think you can appreciate just how little the system has changed in response to the internet, right? The system looks more or less identical. I mean, if anything, it's hardened, yes, rather than weakened the power of journals. And that is just a catastrophic failure for science.
Absolutely. So that's a great time to broaden our discussion into something which at least, the community tried. And I want to talk about the open access initiative. Now, you have been initially a big advocate of open access journal, but let's face it, open access journals are not a panacea. Soon after, the greedy commercial and society journals realized that there are additional revenues to be made through open access journal, they all started their own. Now, there is something that I want to discuss that is linked with the open access journal, which is the article processing charge at APC. Now, there is one angle, which is the journals themselves. And I must say, the society journals, and you have written and talked about it as much as anyone else, are as greedy as the commercial journals in opening their own open access portals, open access journals, and try to see a revenue stream. But this APC, the article processing charge, is fairly unjust to most people in the developing world. Now, for those who do not know what it is a fee that the authors pay to the journals to make their articles completely free or open to the rest of the world from the day one that the article is published. In India, and I'm sure in most low and middle income countries, the article processing charged by most journalists is very high. In fact, I can give you an example. Some of the nature journal, the article processing fee is actually almost 50% to one of the grant that I have right now. And that gives you an idea how large it can be. This may sound, for folks like you who are in the US, where the grant amount is usually large and maybe okay from the grant to pay the article processing charge. But for most in low and middle income countries, this is a death call. Now, just to put that in context, as I said, sometimes it can be as large as 50-60% of the grants. Now, in India, additionally, for example, we do not have any line items in our grant where we can actually ask the government agencies to get APC that we can pay. Now, what I want to understand from you today is why is it so expensive? And this is a question we often ask. I often ask, my students often ask, why is it so expensive to publish scientific papers in the era of internet? We both agree that the journals do not do much, but I'm talking about commercial journals, but at the same time, most journals, and including eLife, where you are the editor-in-chief, where they charge a lot to get published.
Yeah.
Do you think it's possible in the era of internet, where world is connected, we can actually do this job at a much lower price?
Yeah. So let me tackle a few things there. So first of all, I mean, I completely agree with you. The open access push has gone off the rails in many ways because it was corrupted. I mean, I think in retrospect, when you say, we started open access journals, the problem was not open access. The problem was journal, right? Like the fact that we tried to, the open access was born to try to correct a still, in my mind, bigger problem, which was that when it launched, I was probably one of the few people in the world who had access to the whole scientific literature because I was working at Stanford with a incredibly wealthy institution that could subscribe to basically every journal that anybody wanted to read. When we started PLOS, the Public Library of Science, to kind of make open access real, I was at University of California. Now, most people would not think of the University of California as a poor institution. We're not, but I was already then experiencing many journals I didn't have access to. I had to, pretend I was still at Stanford to read papers that were relevant to my work. And that problem is compounded. I'm sure you had this experience earlier in your career, right, of just not being able to access the literature. So the idea behind open access, and it's still true, and it's just the way it was implemented was problematic, is that, look, science is handing over money to publishers, a lot of it. And we can talk in a second about why it's so much, but right, we're handing over money to publishers, something like $10 billion a year, coming more or less ultimately from the same pots of money that fund science, right? We're giving them $10 billion a year and saying, okay, publish all these papers. On average, we're giving them about $5,000 a paper across the whole industry. And in the old days, we were giving them all this money via subscriptions, which were buying access to, for a trivial fraction of the world, like only really people at wealthy institutions in the West had access to the full scientific literature. And yeah, some journals would give you better access if you were in a poor country, but it was a haphazard system. It didn't work well. It certainly didn't work well for people who were like at poor institutions in the US even, right? Large numbers of people in science couldn't access the literature, and people outside of research had no access to it at all. Doctors, patients, the public, students, basically no access. So the idea behind open access, and again, it got perverted in over time, but the idea was pretty simple. It's like, okay, publishers, we'll still give you $10 billion a year, but at the very least, you have to make the work freely available to everybody. Okay. So the concept was, it was a different way to funnel money from funders to publishers to ensure that the work got made freely available, better than subscriptions. Now, what actually happened was institutions, as they often do, tried to pass the buck off to somebody else. So the universities who had been paying the subscriptions, they weren't immediately going to take those subscription monies and give it to authors to pay for publishing, right? The problem ultimately is that it became an author connected thing. There is still a right way to do it, which is for the funders to just not make it a transaction. Don't make anybody pay to publish or to read everything. Just give money directly to the publishers and say, look, make everything freely available and let everybody publish for free. And then you have a system that worked. That's what we were hoping would happen. It obviously didn't, because greed always comes into play, and people saw a new way of generating revenue, and as you point out, kind of manipulated it to the point where it's become, for many authors, as big a barrier to doing science as subscriptions were, right? If you can't be a scientist if you can't read papers, but you also can't be a scientist if you can't publish papers. And so it clearly isn't working. We clearly need a system that is centrally funded by the funders of science, who say, we're going to make, publishing is infrastructure for science, just like genome databases are infrastructure for science, or things like that. And it's just going to be free to do. That's the only sane way to do this, right? So the question is, now, when you propose this to people, they're like, well, it's just too expensive. So why is it so expensive? And I think that it's complicated, but the basic answer is, we have journals, right? We have 50,000-ish journals in science, every one of which, is providing a service to customers independently. And I'll tell you, the reason we can't do what you want, which is what you propose, which is just don't have it, make it really cheap, because I can tell you what a cheap system would look like. A cheap system would look like bioRxiv, a place where you can submit your papers, and then some kind of, diffuse system of peer review that happens kind of voluntarily, right? Again, peer review is already voluntary,
Yes.
but it would have to happen in a not just voluntary in the sense of people working for free, but kind of in a disorganized community way. I can tell you what would happen if we said that's how it's going to work. Someone would submit their paper and it wouldn't get peer reviewed, and then they'd be like, okay, who do I call to talk about my paper not getting peer reviewed? And you're like, well, you wanted a cheap system, so we don't have any staff who can answer your call, right? So we're like, okay, we need staff, so we have to hire someone to answer your call to try to find peer reviewers, right? Like the real expense is in by and large is in hiring people who manage the system. And now I still think we could do it infinitely better if we didn't have to replicate that system over 50,000 different journals, right? Like I think it would still cost money, right? Like to do it well. But if you gave me that $10 billion a year, right? If you said, here's $10 billion a year, go run a publishing system. I would say, and you gave me carte blanche to create it, I would basically build it around a souped up version of bioRxiv, just like really, really good, efficient ingestion of manuscripts and conversion into pretty papers that people can interact with, that allow authors to do whatever they want to do. Okay, I don't know what that would cost, but it wouldn't be $10 billion a year. Right. And then I would have a single kind of unified system for handling peer review that recognized that, the main job of the kind of journal is to connect papers to reviewers, and I would invest in a sort of efficient ways to have people participate in peer review and to identify peer reviewers. I cannot imagine that whole system would cost much more than a few $100 million a year to run, even at its most gold-plated standard. So if you give me $10 billion a year, I create this system, I'll retire a billionaire after a month, right? Like it's like, it is absurd. And I think, at the end of the day, the problem is basically that we have journals, right? You cannot have an efficient, cost-effective way where everything is done, where so much value is placed on the outcome, and you can't then do that on a budget. Like if we're going to say publishing in Nature is worth your career, of course people are going to pay to publish in Nature, whatever kind of, and do whatever they want. Like we can't break the economics of the system until we devalue it as an output, and until we just decide that journals just don't make sense. Like
Exactly.
I really do think we could do a lot better, but we can't do much better within the constraints of the journal architecture.
System. I mean, I still can't understand that why the top 20 economies of the world, they can come and say, we're going to contribute $500 million each. And that becomes $1 billion, which you said is insanely high to publish everything. Because
Look,
we are not paid, reviewers are not paid, the practicing scientist editors are not paid. So we can only pay the staff to chase the reviewers.
yeah, look, I mean, I don't disagree. Like the economics make little to no sense. I mean, I think that, stuff costs more than people think, right?
Right.
Like it's everybody always thinks everything should be free until they need customer service, right? You're just like, right?
And
Like I think it's, but we would definitely, first of all, we know that journals make a ton of profit. So
yes,
let's not get ourselves. Like
yes,
a lot of that $10 billion is just pure skimming profit off the top by publishers who know they have a monopoly and they use it to make money. I mean, Elsevier's profit margins are higher than almost anybody's, and
exactly.
so some of this is just pure profit driven. But even if you got profit out of it, like it's still an inefficient, it's still a deeply inefficient system. And I know that, like, look, we've tried at PLOS and eLife. We've really tried to do this as inexpensively as we can while still maintaining the kind of meeting the expectations of customers. And it still costs us a couple $1,000s to handle a manuscript, right? And that's, some of that could be eliminated by not working in the UK and going somewhere. Like there's ways to make it cheaper, but it's not going to be free if you, and as long as you have to multiply those costs by 50,000 because you have 50,000 journals, it's still gonna cost more than you'd like it to.
We the scientific community really applaud the efforts that you're making in eLife, and whether it's ultimately going to be successful or not, time will say. But like I mentioned, we don't know unless we try. So we got to try different ways because the current system doesn't work. Now we have 1.5 minutes left, and I definitely want to ask the last question, which is important. But the final question I want to ask you is, about the Indian scientific community. And we are obsessed with just not publishing in Nature and Science, but obsessed with the impact factor. And we talked a lot.
Sure.
Before we leave, do you have some suggestions for the Indian scientific community and you have given plenty, that why impact factor is not important, and why they should really look to a new system of dissemination of scientific information? And as you mentioned, and I believe, publishing in Nature, Science, or Cell is not a bad idea, but that's not it. There is something else to it. So we have less than 1 minute before it ends. So if you have a quick suggestion for the Indian scientific community.
Look, I think India could revolutionize the world by just saying they're going to not participate in this system. It doesn't really work for India. It doesn't work for Indian science as well as it to meet the amount of money they spend on it. And they could start a system of their own that other people would emulate. That's what I would do if I were in charge of science in India. I would just say, screw it. The system is corrupt, expensive, and isn't serving us well.
I just want to thank you for your time. I really appreciate that, in your busy schedule, you could find time. And I would love to jump in another session whenever you have time.